Well, a very good evening to everyone. I think we have about 149 registrations for this evening, so thank you all for coming along. My name's Tim Fell. I'm chair of BSA Stamma, and as you all know, it's International Stammering Awareness Day tomorrow. And it's not by accident that the launch of Stamma's new public awareness campaign coincides with ISAD this year. And what we're trying to do is to get people to think about the language that they use when talking about stammering. And we're drawing attention to and changing the words used to describe stammering in the entries of famous people in Wikipedia. And let me give you some examples. Plagued by, affliction, suffer from, overcoming, a terrible impediment, conquer. And of course, this language is endemic. It's not just confined to Wikipedia. It's a pervasive view of stammering as a defect that's there to be defeated. And the problem with that is that it gives stammerers, particularly young people who stammer, the feeling that they're a failure, that they're broken and need mending, when all we do is stammer. That's how we talk. And the campaign is called Find the Right Words. And who better to discuss the use of language and the power of meaning behind those words than two internationally renowned writers, both of whom are active patrons of our charity and both of whom stammer. Margaret Drabble and David Mitchell, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us, Tim.
It just so happens that we had a quote this morning from the chief executive of Wikimedia UK, and I'm just going to read it out by way of introduction. She says, Wikimedia UK is committed to developing an inclusive culture across the Wikimedia projects and helping to eliminate bias. Wikipedia's wording around stammering was not neutral before and reinforced negative perceptions about stammering. So what Stamma has done should positively affect how people understand it.
Isn't that mature?
So
lack of defensiveness is really engaging.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? And we don't talk about other disabilities anymore as defects or weaknesses. We expect tolerance and acceptance. And I'm just wondering why it's taken us so long to start talking about stammering in a different way.
Would you like to go first, Margaret?
I think partly it's because it's invisible and often intermittent. It's not something that's with you every day and every speech of your life, like some visible problems that people have. I probably shouldn't use the word problem, but you know what I mean. It is an invisible barrier that isn't always recognizable even to oneself. And therefore I think people ignore it because it's not in their face all the time. It's not obvious.
That makes a lot of sense to me too. I've never thought about this question in my life, so in a positive way I'm slightly at a loss for words, but the intermittency is surely a factor. It's perhaps prevented the kind of international movement or collaboration from forming to identify this as an injustice.
Yes, and there's also the very interesting question about, you said other countries. I mean, other countries have very different incidents of stammering, and it is a very strange thing that we share, and that is different in different languages. It's different when you sing, it's different when you speak, it's different when you're alone, and it's so changeable.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense. I think more physically identifiable or more sensory linked types of disability they're visible as a kind of a uniform, and where you have a uniform, you can form a cohort, you can form a pressure group, you can form a lobby. We can pass so easily, many of us at least, as someone without a stammer, and especially, I suppose, bringing it back to the Wikipedia/Wikimedia quote. We can pass so easily as normal. And because of the negative images around stammering, many of us wish to. I certainly did. Had we been having this conversation in 1992 instead of 1990 or 2000 instead of 2020, I would also have, I think, well, I don't think I would have been here. I would have been happily hiding behind the camouflage that I was able, again, intermittently, not perfectly, to erect. And so things have changed. Tim.
I mean, I think part of the problem is that people who stammer are understandably rather backwards in coming forward. We don't talk about it very much for obvious reasons. But what do you think has been the catalyst for the change that it is going on now? Because here we are talking about using different language, but why do you think that is?
I can't really address a national narrative. In some ways, you would be the expert, Tim, here, maybe more than Margaret and myself. Speaking purely for myself, however, I think it's to do with age. I've reached a point in my life where I have to either accept the totality of what I am, or be unhappy with myself. And I'd rather have the acceptance. And perhaps I'm slightly grasping at straws here, but when I see other people do this, when I see people at the BSA and the people I've met through the BSA and spoken to my fellow patrons of the BSA, and when we talk about stammering, when I see their acceptance of it, then this somehow makes it okay for me to do the same, which is not a confession of very original thinking there, but perhaps we're all influenced by the environment we're in to a certain degree.
But in terms of the language that you personally use, do you think that has changed over the years? I mean, Margaret, I've read a few articles that you wrote over the years, and you sometimes refer to suffering from a stammer. Is that this sort of language that you would still use today, or would you think again about the phrase suffer from?
My stammer has caused me suffering. I wouldn't deny it. There have been occasions when it has been very difficult, but it has not made my life into suffering. So I don't suppose I wouldn't. What would I say? I do stammer, but I stammer so intermittently that it's very hard to describe what it is that I do. But it is a very fluctuating condition. So when I say I stammer, people sometimes say to me, and I'm sure you know a lot of people who are in this position, people say, oh no, you don't stammer, you're talking perfectly fluently. So when I say I suffer from a stammer, I suppose I mean it comes over me, sometimes at extraordinarily inconvenient moments. And I think that is something that we've all shared. Sometimes you can see it coming, sometimes it's out of the blue, and you just can't find words that will do that you can say at that moment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, sorry, I interrupted you, David.
No, I was just about to make the point that yes, you know, I think I certainly would have suffered from my stammer as well. A crucial point, however, I think it's up to stammerers to be the ones to choose the language they would use to describe their stammer. Why I like the Wikipedia alterations is that it's making a point, it's a political point, that it's okay for us to describe it however we wish, because we're the ones who are either suffering or coming to a working accommodation with, which is how I think of my stammer these days. It isn't okay for non-stammerers to tell us how we should be feeling about it. This is why I'm so proud of the campaign you've been conducting.
Yes,
I've always felt very strongly against it being presented in a comic manner in fiction or on stage or in cinema. I just don't like people laughing at it. I don't like it, and I never have.
Yes, it's nauseating, and when you're a kid, it kind of increases the stick that you take. When I was a kid, and I'd rather feel I'm interrupting you now, Tim. If so, I apologise. But there was the Ronnie Barker show, Open All Hours, which was a very successful sitcom in the 1980s. It was on Sunday evening, and it filled me with a kind of sick, cold dread when it was on. Even though in many ways, Ronnie Barker was, if he wasn't a comic genius, then who was? But blimey, when that program was on, I would get this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, because I knew that when I went to school the next day, laughing at stammering had been justified nationally. So some kind of invisible barometer needle had kind of swung from not okay to okay, and I was going to be on the receiving end of that. So I think over.
I think Open All Hours is an interesting one, because it was originally written by Roy Clark without a stammer in Arkwright, but it was Ronnie Barker that proposed that Arkwright should have a stammer. And
really?
So that was written into the character. But
I didn't know
why
that.
would he do that?
I didn't know that.
Well, I can't think of. Well, I mean, we would have to ask him, and we can't. But I would guess because it got laughs.
Yes.
And ouch.
Yes.
There are.
Or he could have thought that that stammering is what miserly, devious, slightly dishonest people do. You know, it's the sort of character flaw exposed.
But I always admired Derek Jacobi's performance in I, Claudius, and I was just watching a clip of that today to remind myself. And of course, Claudius is presented as a most interesting and complex character, but also Derek's stammer is very convincing and Ronnie Barker's isn't. Now, I think there's a difference in seeing a stammer represented in somebody who is genuinely stammering, which Derek Jacobi doesn't do, but who is actually in the role of stammering, and somebody who is setting it up as a target for fun. And I feel it's perfectly okay in I, Claudius, because we know from historical records that he did have a speech hesitation, to portray him, particularly when the character is very sympathetic in many ways. Not in all ways, but in many ways.
And at least he'd done his homework. At least he wasn't stammering on any old word because it was one at the end of the sentence. At least he knew you stammer on a relative, well, speaking for myself, but a relatively small number of consonants, S's, hard C's, and K's in my case. But you can always spot a fake stammer because it's all over the alphabet.
Yes, exactly.
But I think in Ronnie Barker's defense, he did think long and hard about the stammer, and I think, as far as I'm aware, he may have consulted the BSA at that time. I'm not sure, but he still decided to go ahead with it. And that's, you know, but interestingly, David, I want to just take you back to 2006. in your book, Black Swan Green, because something that you said in there interests me. You said, oh, you asked the question, who decides which defects are funny and which ones tragic? And I think that's a really interesting point. You probably wouldn't ask it in the same way today, because I think that no one would think that any defect is funny, but you obviously felt that there was a distinction.
When I was 13, and the character in that book, Jason, is
Yes.
that age, it certainly felt pretty tragic. And a plausible 13-year-old may well sort of written in 2006, set in 1982, certainly wouldn't have the vocabulary or the dexterity to use it, as I guess a 51-year-old novelist in 2020 has, hopefully on a good day with the wind behind me. No, I'm going to stand by it. It's a character, and Jason, as I did, had to live with continual mortification, or the fear of mortification. And yes, I know there are more tragic things that people all over the world right now of all ages have to put up with than a stammer, which actually may be one reason why, this goes back to your first question, why it's taken this long for this conversations like these to shift the narrative in a more illuminated direction. However, it was then, and yes, it felt absolutely awful. My stammer was this parasitic vampire that was determined to wreck my life and trash my future and whittle down what I could possibly do as an adult to lighthouse keeper and Trappist monk and possibly novelist, which ironically is what I've become, but that's not the point.
But just going on from that, and the same question to Margaret really is that, do you feel that that experience contributed to your skills to as writers and as wordsmiths today?
I've certainly always known that writing was something I could do in which I would never encounter this particular problem. I'm using the word problem again, but you never run into it when you're on the page. Whereas as soon as you move into the media, and if you're a successful writer these days, it's almost obligatory to move into the media and be on television and give lectures and that kind of thing. So there is a problem, even as a writer, when you're supposed to be making speeches at dinners and lunches. I never do dinners and lunches because the combination of having to eat and speak is just too much for me. It's too embarrassing in every way. So there are sort of certain things that you really don't want to do, but you know that you can write. But I have to say that I did really want to be an actress, and on stage I didn't stammer very much. So there you go.
My first ever public event, there's a bit of a family connection here, Margaret, but your sister Antonia, known to the world as A.S. Byatt, very kindly persuaded my publisher to fly me over from Japan as an unpublished writer to sort of be her support act in about 1999, just before my first novel was out. And that was one of the most frightening things I've ever done. I'd never done it. I'd studiously avoided any kind of public situation where I would speak in front of a large number of people and could possibly block. I'd never done that. And even to the extent of having a secret deal with my headmaster that I wouldn't have to do an assembly, which all the prefects had to do, all of this stuff. But that was sort of the moment when some kind of buck stopped there. And if I wanted to be a writer, that kind of thing is obligatory to do a public reading. And I blocked a little bit, but it went okay.
And thereafter, you were more confident about doing it, were you?
Yeah, once I've done it once. Yeah. Like you, however, it pops up at the most bizarre times. And I did one in, well, I think writing Blacks on Green was quite a cathartic experience for me. I hope that any people with more a direct experience of LGBTQ issues won't find the comparison distasteful, but that book slightly outed myself as a stammerer, and wow, that was good for me. I remember one event for actually the novel After Blacks on Green in London. I was doing a stammerer. I was doing a reading, hit a stammer word, and wow, sort of I wasn't going to get around this. So in some ways, thanks to Blacks on Green and thanks to a change in the air, and I guess a change in myself, but also a change in the narrative of stammering, I just said, well, everyone, I can't say this word, so I'm going to spell it out, and could the person on the front row please say this word for me? And if I have to do this again, so I kind of incorporated the audience into, as Americans would say, owning it. And there was such a warm response from that. It was the opposite of mortification. Suddenly they were really on my side. And I've used that method ever since. It's if I'm the one to point it out, if I'm the one to say, I apologize, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm going to need your help for this, then it's really rather lovely.
I think that's very ingenious of you. I think people who stammer can be quite ingenious about how they deal with it. They have little tricks that they use.
A big
get by.
Bag of tricks. I mean, that's almost the nuclear option. That one. I don't use it often, and even now, as perhaps you are. I'd like to listen to a question actually. Margaret, have you found that this bag of tricks, you can incorporate them and you get more and more skilled at them to such a degree that you sort of weld them on or graft them on, and they kind of become indistinguishable from how you speak anyway?
No. I never learn anything. I never make steady progress. And it is very, very odd. In the last few months, I've been reading aloud to my husband quite a bit. And you'd think I was perfectly relaxed, happy reading a book. Suddenly I find myself stuck on a word. I don't know. I've been reading because his eyesight's not very good. But I don't know why. There's no problem in the text. There's no problem in me. And suddenly maybe I'm so relaxed, I don't mind if I do. I mean, these are the kind of questions we ask ourselves.
Yeah, that's fine too. I've got a few tricks. One I call the consonant shift, and I think of it as I can visualize it as Scrabble tiles. So I stammer on S's. So if I want to order the salad in a restaurant, then I know there's going to be a block with the S. However, I can say allard without any problem. So I will ask for thus allard.
Thus allard.
Yeah.
So two words, salad.
Thus and allard. And
very clever.
And you string them along. I do this all the time.
You do it all. It's one of your regular tricks.
It's an old favourite. It really lets me down. The Scrabble tile shift.
I'm not good with B's, and one of my worst moments ever was when I had to announce that Hilary Mantel had won, and this was live on Melvyn Bragg's television. I had to announce that she'd won the prize for Bring Up the Body, and I thought, I can't change the title. I can't pretend she wrote another novel. I can't say her third trilogy. But to my enormous relief, I shouldn't say this, but the person who'd announced the prize before, on very high heels, fell up the step onto the podium. So I thought, no matter what I do, at least I'm not going to fall over. So there we go. We trade off our problems.
Using the
I think
Scrabble tile shift, super quick. I would have got around that by saying, and the prize has gone to Hilary Mantel for ring up the oddies.
You see, I couldn't have worked that one out. That's very clever of you. I'll practice it.
It's all yours if it's helpful. Tim, sorry, I interrupted you.
And then I was just going on to say that it's interesting to reflect that on the effect that the same phrase has on different people. For example, get rid of suggests to people who don't stammer that stammering can be cured. At the same time, people who stammer feel worthless or failure if they can't get rid of it. And clearly, words can influence our daily lives. As writers, you might be able to help us navigate through this quite difficult area to find the right language to use. I think that's the basis of the campaign that we're running at the moment. So, do you have any phrases or words that you think we could replace with the ones that are currently used, for example, on Wikipedia?
Well, I've already used the word problem, which is probably not correct. David, what do you think? What could we say? A positive or neutral word.
Neutrality is attractive.
Yes.
Issue has become a cliche.
Issue. Oh yeah, yeah.
I wonder if there's a slight cart before the horse thing here. I wonder if first we should. Well, again, I can't speak about other people's experiences, but just my own. The moment I stopped thinking of my stammer in terms of it being an enemy, that was a watershed moment for me, because all these years, I suppose I had been influenced by the language. So maybe the horse is before the cart after all, but I've been influenced by the language because there weren't any alternatives. I had been, all my life, I thought of it as an enemy that I was failing to overcome, that I was afflicted by. And if you're afflicted by this thing, then it's your own fault for not fighting back hard enough. So I had to fight back harder. And it was just a question of willpower. That's what I believed. And I still see this pernicious myth everywhere. Just try harder, then you can spit it out, without any acknowledgement that actually stammerers are already trying harder than the fluent majority can ever guess, just to pick up the phone as a kid, just to talk to a girl as a boy, just to answer the phone in my first job as a Saturday boy at Woolworths. Wow, the willpower just to force my hand to pick it up and say, hello, Woolworths. It's insulting to imply that stammerers lack willpower. You've got people have no idea how much willpower we have just to get through the day. Yet, because of the language, it wasn't enough. So I thought I needed more and more, and it was still my fault, and it was still my fault. And in some ways, partly as a result of writing Black Swan Green, which is tremendously cathartic for me, I had to guide my protagonist to, I suppose, the place I wanted to be guided to. I wish I had been guided to retrospectively, where my stammer was a kind of passenger in the vehicle with me. It was along for the ride. And as long as I attacked it, it would attack me back. As long as I thought of it as an enemy, almost as if we were two souls in locked in mortal combat for possession of the same body. Obviously, I read too much fantasy as a kid, if you can read too much fantasy as a kid, but that's how I thought. And once I stopped thinking that way and thought, well, actually, what if this, well, first, this clearly hasn't worked. If all you needed was willpower, there would be no stammerers on the planet, because we're already trying that all the time. So clearly you need more than willpower. It's nothing to do with willpower. And I gently curse any non-stammerer who has written a character or put one in a film where they imply the stammer is because of a lack of willpower. However, if I stop thinking of those terms and start thinking of my stammer as this entity that has a right to exist, then maybe it will reciprocate. Maybe it will let me exist as well. So if I say, well, sort of, hello, stammer. In the book, I call him Hangman. Or Jason calls him Hangman because he first appeared during a game of Hangman in the classroom. If I let Hangman stammer from time to time, maybe it'll give me the odd favour back and let me speak in public once in a while. And if I actually acknowledge my stammer in public and say, here he is, he's real and he's here, and I'm going to introduce you to my stammer now. Maybe he'll kind of, like maybe that's like handling a teenager intelligently and giving the kid who acts up some responsibility in class to improve his self-esteem a bit.
Yes, I mean, you
and that was the beginning of many, many good things in terms of my relationship with my stammer. And I would credit this with the fact that I can do what we're doing now without me being terrified of the mortification that will come with a block. Tim, I keep speaking over you. I apologise.
No, you mentioned teenagers, and that's a nice lead in to talking about communication, really, because many teenagers and school leavers at the moment are applying for jobs, and many job ads have this stated requirement: good communication skills are needed. And of course, that puts off people who stammer from applying for those jobs. And yet, some of our best writers and actors stammer. I mean, you're both at the top of your game at communication, and you stammer. Some people might see that as a contradiction, but clearly stammering is no bar to great communication. How can we convince young people who stammer and employers that good communication skills are much more about fluency? And should those skills be taught at school, Margaret?
Well, I do remember at school being told by my English teacher that I could never be a teacher because my speech wasn't good enough. And I thought, oh, well, you know, to hell with that, I'll find something else to do. But I was hurt. I was rather hurt. And I remember my father saying of a boyfriend of my sister, he wanted to be a barrister, and he said he's going to have a very hard time at the bar. And of course, there are professions in which fluency is considered desirable. So maybe I became a writer to avoid doing all the other things I wasn't supposed to be able to do. I don't know. It's hurtful to be told you can't do something because of your speech. And I think young people should just ignore that completely and carry on with what they want to do, and ignore any suggestion that they can't do it because they probably can.
I would agree completely. The presence of role models will, I think, incrementally erode this bar. Politicians like our fellow patron Ed Balls would occasionally stammer in the Commons, and just to see that, I think A, would be tremendously encouraging to any young person, and B, I remember some conservative, I'm afraid, though let's keep politics out of it, slightly mocked him for having given an inarticulate response, and there was a minor and rather healthy storm in a teacup. That wasn't okay, and he had to apologise and make clear that I can't remember who it was, but it would be ungallant to name his name, but because he's not here to defend himself. But he did say the next day that he wasn't laughing at Ed Balls' stammer, but at the content of the response. I guess role models is one case, and maybe just to campaigns like the one we're discussing this evening, I think, can have it takes time. It's not overnight, but the fact these campaigns exist. Narratives in society continually change. They're constantly shifting, and the agents of these change are organisations, and like the BSA, and the conversations that such organisations engender. Finally, just on the subject, I'd just like to say, and I think I'm continuing from points that both of you have made. When you're young and you cannot be fluent on the outside, at least speaking through personal experience, and I'm going to bet that Margaret might have found the same. Margaret did find the same as well. You tend to be more fluent on the inside. I very quickly had to learn how to read sentences I was going to say, like an auto cue, spot the block letters in those sentences, quickly work out diversions that would bypass the word I was going to block on, all without the other person catching on, in an appropriate register. You can't use highfalutin language, even if it would do the job. You have to use age-appropriate language, or you then get mocked for speaking posh, at the school I went at least, as opposed to stammering. You have to do all of this. If this isn't good communication, what is? And it's interesting that those ads, good communication skills required, what it means is good verbal communication skills required. It's interesting that the fluent majority think of communication as exclusively verbal communication. Perhaps if we just chip away at that conversation by conversation, encounter by encounter, and in some ways do exactly what we're doing. It's a long, slow road, but with determination and good humour and willpower, we'll get there eventually.
Yes, I mean, I think we talk about communication as being verbal, but I think stammering equally is no bar to eloquence. You know, I think emotion, enthusiasm, gestures, silences, eye contact, structure, all impact on eloquence. It's interesting that the BBC over the years has had contributors who stammered. I'm thinking of Elizabeth Bowen, for example, who was a regular contributor in the 60s and 70s, I think was right, and she had a stammer. Patrick Campbell on Call My Bluff had a stammer. Jonathan Miller, raconteur extraordinaire, had a stammer. All overt stammerers, but all the epitome of eloquence. And interesting, Margaret, that after you appeared on Desert Island Discs, you said that you felt safe in the knowledge that the BBC would edit out any stammer. Do you think they would do that today?
It depends to what extent you're blocked. I mean, if it actually holds the programme up, I think that both the BBC and I would be grateful if they edited it. And I have to confess that I don't really like doing live shows. It's partly because you have to get up so early in the morning for them, but I just don't like doing them. So I prefer to have a kind of safety net if something is going out. I'm very, very happy to talk in this context, because what we're talking about is about what we're talking about. But there are some contexts in which I remember an appalling moment when I was asked on the Today programme what I thought about the expanding universe, because I'd been judging some science prize, and my mind went totally blank. I should have said it's expanding because of red something or other, what's it called? But I just said, oh, it's expanding, and I gave some utter rubbish reply, which has nothing to do with stammering, but it just proved I wasn't fit to judge the Science Book Award. So there you are. You all make mistakes.
But we don't see anyone on television these days who stammers other than in a comedic role or portraying a character flaw. When do you think there'll be a presenter or continuity announcer with a stammer on television?
I don't know, because I'm not at the BBC, but I think it's a great idea. There's sometimes a guest slot, a guest presenter on the Today programme, isn't there?
Yes.
And I think that would be a great coup. I think that could be something really valid for BSA Stammer to aim at.
Elizabeth Byrne had a beautiful way of stylizing her stammer. I mean, she made it sound very poetic indeed. And so they need somebody who is eloquently stammering as a presenter, and everyone would love it.
Well, it was
pioneers have to pay. I'm speaking over you again, Tim, but the moment will pass, so I apologise. But I would like to hear someone who blocks quite substantially. It's a bit like the Aesop's fable about who will bell the cat, but change happens because of people at the front of the wave, people perhaps more brave than me, who will say, or who perhaps are more militant than me. A part of me now thinks, well, if I stammer and there's any mortification around, then I'm afraid it's going to be your mortification and not mine. But someone who can think that even more, to the degree of stammering on live radio a number of times in the morning. Perhaps I'm too much of a coward to volunteer myself, but I think if that point could be made, if people would hear it. No, I am jumping about all over the place. Apologies, Tim, but the reason I loved the King's speech was, I think for the first time in cinematic history, it wasn't that we could see a stammer. It wasn't even that we could see a stammer sympathetically portrayed. It was that non-stammerers could see their faces looking at someone stammering. That's what that was the coup of that. That was why I'm so profoundly grateful to the film, whatever faults it may or may not have had. But that had never been done before. This ugly thing. This people don't know they do it, but they do. And for the first time on the King's Speech, I could see it. A whole stadium full of them could see it. Anyway, I've gone down a rabbit hole. Rescue us from the rabbit hole that I've brought us down, Tim, please.
Well, I think the King's Speech is an interesting area, but the other area that I was quite interested in the public reaction to stammering. I mean, you mentioned Ed Balls earlier on, David, but I want to just give you a quote from John Updike, the American poet, who said this: "Those who stutter win in the painful pauses of their demonstration that speech isn't entirely natural, a respectful attention, a tender alertness." Now, I'm not sure that Ed Balls would agree with that at the stage that he was replying to George Osborne's budget speech back in 2012, and I don't know if you remember that, but the reaction that he got from the opposite benches obviously angered Margaret hugely, because she wrote in the Independent at that time. She said, she described them as red-faced Tories braying with stage laughter.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you would like to see the naming and shaming of public figures who mock stammering, which after all should be as much as a no-go area as laughing at blind people who can't see, or use of racial terminology.
You mentioned to me the other day, Tim, that Joe Biden stammers. I didn't even know that. And I hadn't realized that Trump was mocking him for it. But I guess people make fun of Trump for so many reasonable attitudes that Biden has sort of slipped under the net for me. And I've tried to listen to him since you mentioned it, but I actually haven't managed to find a clip of him stammering. So I have a feeling that it is not being pilloried in the same way. And maybe this is an indication of, I mean, Trump may mock, but he mocks most that is wise and good. And I don't think that the general attitude towards Biden is colored by what I gather is a genuine stammer, which occurs occasionally. But I don't know, Tim. I think you know more about his speech than I do.
I mean, it would be unimaginable that the same thing would happen today. I think particularly that there seems to be a lot more openness in the House of Commons than there was, and I'm sure you remember the disclosure on mental health by the MPs, Kevin Jones and Charles Walker. So I think it would be unimaginable today that people would mock a stammer in the House of Commons. Perhaps I'm wrong. I just want to go back to some comments that have been coming in, because there are some interesting ones. When I asked what the catalyst was for a change of language, as a comment from Sam Simpson, and she says the increased, I'm losing it actually, where is it? The increased engagement with the social model of disability within the stammering community has shone a light on the attitudinal barriers, stereotypical language, and thin negative narratives that prevail around stammering. Patrick Campbell also spearheaded the discussion paper, The Way We Talk, for the BSA, that has been instrumental in changing the narrative.
Sam has most excellent communication skills, since we were on the subject.
She actually goes on to say, no, we need more stammering in the media to have a greater representation and debunk these stereotypical views. So we want more continuity of announcers with a stammer and presenters with stammer, and I think she's right.
But I mean, we're all being very idealistic here. We all know that presenters quite often are commissioned because they talk very, very, very fast, particularly on the Today programme early in the morning, and also because they're young and beautiful if they're women, and old and handsome if they're men. And so there is, the whole thing is so selected and so unrepresentative that we're kind of hoping for a miracle, in hoping that people with real speech problems will be employed as presenters. I'm sorry to say that, but I feel that if you're a woman over 50, you're out. If you're, there are many disqualifications apart from speech that disqualify you from presenting.
But I think the same was considered true many years ago. I'm sure women wouldn't have been allowed to present. You wouldn't have had anyone that spoke with a northern accent in days gone by. You wouldn't have had someone presenting a sports program in a wheelchair. So do you not think it's high time that we incorporated stammering in the same vein?
Yes, of course, and you're absolutely right about the wheelchair. We have now become accustomed and delighted by the presenters in wheelchairs on a variety, not necessarily programs about disability, but a variety of programs, and that has completely normalized the sight of people. That doesn't mean that people in wheelchairs lead an easy life, but things like the Paralympics, the campaigns that have been fought in the press to normalize certain things that were edited out of the media are now they've been very successful. So let us hope that Stamma has the same kind of success. You're making us think very hard. These are new thoughts for some of us.
Yeah, and you used a good phrase, hoping for a miracle, a moment ago, Margaret. It's both true, we are, and it is also true that 20, 30, 40 years can bring a miracle a lot closer, and give it time. Miracles don't seem so miraculous anymore. Things get normalized in ways that a generation ago we could never have imagined. It's why it's one of many reasons why the future is such an unforeseeable and potentially exciting place.
Yes, I mean, I think it's not too far away before we have someone who has a speech difficulty, who finds it more difficult to talk than other people might. On television, I think that would be a very major step forward in what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Yes, it would.
I've got another comment here from someone which would be interesting. We need social change, which I think we all agree. What books changed the perspective of Margaret and David?
On stammering or on...
I think more broadly on social change, I suspect.
At least for me, it tends to be more incremental. I read articles, I read newspapers, magazines. Sometimes they're the weather vane, sometimes they're the wind, sometimes they're a bit of both. It's quite hard to identify. On the subject of autism, I could point to a couple of fairly, for me, inner epoch-shifting texts of types that were not only unlike anything I'd ever read, but were a whole brand new kind of writing by autistic people. However, with stammering, maybe there's something to be gained from comparing the two, but going back to Margaret's opening remark about the invisibility and intermittency of stammering, I think perhaps this is reflected in the literature a little bit as well. It's both more omnipresent, or it's more ubiquitous, but much more quietly, or much less dramatic in terms of shifting what you thought before you read the book to what you think afterwards. Would you agree, Margaret? Or can you put your finger at...
Books can have many messages within them, and some of them are contradictory. I mean, I think Bernardine Evaristo's last novel is a wonderfully exemplification of social change in women's lives. I mean, extraordinary social change in women's lives and Black lives.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it enormously. But Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, a book which has been enormously important to me and to the feminist movement, which I don't identify myself with that totally, also has a character who starts to stammer when they having problems with their position in the Communist Party, and also has some homophobic remarks. So even our greatest writers can be afflicted by some of the prejudices of their age, and Doris was one of them.
Yeah.
Although what she was saying was groundbreaking, nevertheless, there were attitudes that were of the past in the same book. So writers are very complicated, and the message they give isn't simple.
Yeah, and when they're doing it through the filter of fiction, the prism can be even more fractured, and the way it refracts light can be more complex and tangled.
Yes, that's true.
I'm afraid we are coming towards the end of our allotted time. But I'd just like to finish, David, by referring to your speech your keynote speech at the International Stammering Association's Congress in Holland. I was at that actually, and I was spellbound for the half an hour that you were speaking. It was absolutely phenomenal.
Oh, thank you.
It was called 13 Ways of Looking at a Stammer. You got to 12, and then you decided to add on the 13th. And I wonder if you could just expand on that 13th way of looking at a stammer for us.
Well, I remember it slightly, I think I remember it ever so slightly differently. I think I could only think of 12 ways when I was writing the speech. So I slightly copped out and left the 13th way as a kind of a blank and said the 13th way is how you would like to think of it. These are 12 of mine, but 13 is yours, which is one of those swizzes, really, isn't it? But afterwards, I walked down from the platform and this big, friendly, stammering Australian walked up to me and said, "I've got 13 for you, mate. It's a gift." And so when I came to write up the speech for later use, I remembered that. So only in the written form is number 13 the gift. What I mean from that is, again, I can't generalize, but for myself, I may well have become a novelist had I not stammered, but I am certain I wouldn't have been the exact novelist I am without my stammer. Because of the reasons I alluded to earlier, because I stammered, I had to become a precocious acquirer of vocabulary. I had to become a juvenile expert in linguistic register. These are skills I use all the time. They aren't even skills. It's sort of it's the things I'm hardwired for now because of my stammer. It was a curse at the time, but in the long term, it became a part of who and what I am. And I'm not going to be ashamed of that. I'm not going to be mortified by that. I can't turn this into advice. I can just turn it into a kind of testament that it's how we speak. If you've got a problem with it, world, it's your problem, not mine. I'll acknowledge its existence. We're all free to choose how we want to think of our stammer. But speaking for myself, in the long term, it's become a part of my life that I wouldn't wish away, not for a moment, because of what it's given me. Who are we? What are we? Central to this is our relationship with language, whether or not we can speak. My son happens to be non-verbal in an autistic sort of way, but he has an immensely rich relationship with language, in English and Japanese, I will add, as a proud dad. And a stammer gives it gives a ferocity and dynamism and an exactitude and a kind of a superpower to one's own relationship with language, I think. That was me on my soapbox. I will now descend from my soapbox.
How do you feel about that, Margaret?
About having a stammer?
About it specifically being a gift.
A gift. Well, it's certainly given me a lot of interesting thoughts that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And I agree with David that it does enrich one's vocabulary, because the search for synonyms leads one into some very baroque digressions sometimes.
Doesn't it?
And that is an enrichment of language. And I have a problem when I'm ringing up the grocers. I don't like the word butter, and I'm always ordering the kind of butter I don't really want, like Lurpak. I think, no, I don't really want that, but it hasn't got the wrong consonant on. So there are much more subtle kind of variations than one kind of butter and another.
And I bet you can say the word thub, and I bet you can say the word utter. So next time, don't ask with the butter, just ask for thub utter, and they won't notice.
Oh, I think I better stick with the New Zealand one. I always say New Zealand. It is very odd. I don't know if this is true of you or other stammerers, that we've sometimes ended up with something that we really didn't mean to ask for.
Yeah.
And that's life. That's a gift.
I think, and that's a very good place to finish. It's a note of hope for, certainly I hope that any young people who stammer are listening this evening, that they will take away the fact that stammering for both Margaret and David has not been a bar to hugely successful careers, and there are many other creative people who stammer like them. So let's not forget the lessons we've heard today from our two guests, and I thank you so much again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you and to get to know you a little bit beforehand as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and to our 149 brothers and sisters in stammering and out there, good luck. And to any other future brother and sister in stammering seeing this on YouTube or whatever, best of luck to you too.
Good luck to us all.